Hello everyone. This week we discuss about frictional plasticity, and in this first lecture I will introduce the Mohr circle and Byerlee's law. So previously in the dynamics of the lithosphere lecture we've discussed about elasticity of the lithosphere, the possibility of viscous creep, and now we start discussing about frictional plasticity. So beyond elasticity, the rocks do deform permanently and they can accommodate large strains. So this is a very nice picture of an outcrop in the Alps. This is called the Glarus thrust. So you see two colors of rocks separated by a sharp line here. That's the Glarus thrust plane. On top you have old Permo-Triassic rocks. Underneath you have younger rocks of Jurassic to Cretaceous age, and the displacement is potentially larger than 100 kilometers, so it's a huge displacement over a very thin shear zones that makes a very large strain. So the strain is extremely localized in a very narrow fault. So that is a manifestation of frictional plasticity. So what do we mean here by plasticity? We actually mean that if you solicitate a material, remember about jumping on the board, you will trigger a deformation. If deformation increases, then stress also increases proportionally. But if you increase the stress too much by jumping, for example, too high on this board, it may break because you exceed a maximum stress level. So plastic deformation is part of irreversible deformations. It can lead to large strains. Strain energy and deformation work is dissipated. It can't be recovered during plastic deformation. Thus, there is entropy production. So what about rocks? How do these features occur in rocks? They often take the form of faults. So that's an example of a very nice normal fault here, breaking a sedimentary sequence. So you can see this type of structure here with, of course, here you see a dextral motion on the fault. So you get discrete planes and thin volumes in which friction matters. So friction on these planes do matter. There is friction between the different sides of the fault and between the grains or clasts that make up a fault rock. Typically, it's called brittle deformation in tectonics. So friction matters at all the scales within the rock. And does it matter for long-term tectonics? Of course. Faults are everywhere in the crust, and they allow for structuring the lithosphere. So that's an example of a cross-section through the Alps. That's the Lausanne cross-section, northwest, southeast. On one side, the European crust with the Jura Mountains. On the right side, you have the Adriatic plate here that makes the backstop. And all the superficial part of the crust, you see here, for example, grabens, thrust, they are all built following the sequences of faults. So the faults are structuring the crust, thus the frictional deformation matters a lot for tectonics at the large scale. Let's have a look at a very simplified sketch here. The faults in general, they are the locus of seismogenic events, so they do matter a lot, of course, for hazards. So that is a sketch. Here you have an example of part of a crop here, and in the middle you would have a barrier. If deformation is applied and there is a dislocation plane or a fault plane here in the middle of this field, then elastic deformation would start. So you would start bending, you would have small elastic deformation being distributed in the system here. But at some point, when the stresses are too large, the system would break and the elastic deformation would be recovered. So on both sides of the fault, then the barrier became straight again, and there is an accumulated irreversible displacement along the fault axis. So that's the idea of how a faulting cycle occurs. And of course, faulting occurs in nature. That's an example of a real crop here. And you see here the displacement marked along the passive markers of the crop field. That's a 3D example. Now you see a fault plane in 3D. That's the gray rectangle here. And there is a textural motion happening along this fault. So this block here is moving towards the right. And when a seismogenic event takes place, there is radiation of seismic waves, and from the parts which are in compression, the parts of the quadrant that are in compression, so this arrow is pointing towards the compression here, on that arrow is pointing towards compression on that side. The waves that are emitted from the compressional quadrant will have a specific displacement in the seismogram, while those emitted by the dilation quadrant will have the opposite, basically, polarity. So how do we get a quantitative knowledge on rock strength? One has to go to the laboratory for this. And the rock strength can be measured using different types of apparatus. That are some examples of devices. That's a Griggs apparatus. So you see that's basically a press in which the rocks can be deformed, and a Patterson rig. Here you basically only see the monitoring device. But with these types of device, what you can do, you can deform a rock sample. So that's an example of a torsion experiment that is carried out in a Patterson rig. So you see a torsion of a rock that is contained within this sample cell here, and that can accumulate strain as it is progressively twisted. And here you see a different type of experiment, an axial compression experiment made with the Griggs apparatus, and you see different kinds of rock samples in post-deformation. So in some cases you have it completely fractured, with mostly vertical fractures here. You can have it faulted with a single fault, and in some cases the faults can be distributed, so you have many faults and they all accommodate part of the displacement that creates a distributed deformation. And in some cases the whole sample can be formed in a ductile manner. So that's now a stress-strain diagram. So that's a sketch of what could be obtained from a rock deformation experiment. There will be a recoverable strain, which is the elastic strain, and a permanent ductile strain. So as you start loading the sample, you will increase the strain, and you start with zero stress. You follow this path, and until this point, everything behaves elastically. It will be recoverable. Then, when the rock starts to become plastic, frictional plastic, and meets the point of rupture, then the elastic strain will be recovered here, and the permanent strain will be recorded by the sample. So that is how things work in principle. We have an elastic strain which is recoverable, and a plastic strain which will not be recovered. By running different deformation experiments on different types of rocks, one may measure what is the maximum shear stress recorded by the rocks. And that's an example here of the Byerlee diagram. So what you see on this axis is the shear stress, and on that axis is a negative normal stress, both in units of megapascal. And many points here, they basically represent a point in the shear stress, normal stress diagram where the rock would start yielding. So that would be the point of failure. So what has been done by Byerlee in 1978, it compiled basically a lot of experiments on different types of rocks. So that's pretty good. What you can observe is a cluster of points along a line here. And this line can be fitted. You see tau is equal 50 plus 0.6 times sigma. So there is a linear fit which is made using those points. And that would be Byerlee's law. So the rock failure can be measured for various loading conditions. And what matters here in terms of loading condition, it's the magnitude of the normal stress. So we apply a normal stress and measure the shear stress. So now that we are discussing about stress, let's discuss about the stress tensor. We will need it in the following steps. So what's the stress tensor? It's basically the representation of a stress state in a three-dimensional volume. So think about an infinitesimal small cube here, and this cube has faces that cut across the x1, x2, and x3 axis. So there is a face which is normal to x1, a face normal to x2, and a face normal to x3. In addition to this, there are tractions that are acting on each of these faces, and this traction may not coincide with the orientation of the x1, x2, and x3 axis. So you see that the tractions here are dipping with regard to the coordinate system x1, x2, x3. So how does it work? One can decompose a traction acting on a face in the three dimension of the space defined by x1, x2, x3. So for example, traction 2 here is decomposed into traction 1, traction 2, and traction 3. The same applies for traction 3 and traction 1. And by collecting these three traction vectors together, so we get the stress tensor in 3D. So this corresponds to traction vector 1 projected on the x1, x2, x3 coordinates. This is traction 2, and this is traction 3. So it's basically the collection of the three traction vectors in space. In 2 dimensions, we make things a bit simpler here. We just represent a square. You see a shear stress and a normal stress is acting on both sets of faces. So in 2 dimensions, we have 4 components. 3 are independent because sigma xy is equal to sigma yx. And we will now introduce the terms. The stresses that are on the diagonal of this object are called the normal stresses. The stresses that are on each side of the diagonal, they will be called shear stresses. So they will be the measures that we're going to talk about. So let's evaluate the traction along the x direction. So to compute a traction out of a tensor, you just multiply the tensor by the direction. So if we want to compute the traction along the x direction, we multiply sigma by n, where n has 1, 0. So it's a unit normal vector, normal to the vertical face. So if we multiply the tensor by the vector 1, 0, we simply obtain a vector, which is sigma xx and sigma yy. If we do the same exercise, but we compute it in the y direction, the normal has now for value 0 and 1, so it's a unit normal in the vertical direction. The product of sigma times n gives a vector which has components sigma xy and sigma yy. Again, we can collect these two traction vectors in a single object, and that is the 2D stress tensor. So there are some specificities about tensors, and here what we'll do, we will assume a rotation of the coordinate system. So we will have an object which will have a stress field, and we will have here a traction vector. The traction can be expressed in xy coordinate, but it can also be expressed in the x prime, y prime coordinate system. So tensors, they're more than just matrices because they are equipped with some rules of objectivity. So it means that the physical laws that are written using tensor, they should not depend on the coordinate system. And that's something we briefly aborde on this slide. So you see the definition of the traction in the xy coordinate is sigma times n. In the rotated coordinate, t prime is sigma prime times n prime. And what matters is that whatever the way you observe the system, the magnitude of the traction should not change. It's not depending on the observer. It should be an intrinsic property. So let's express the traction in rotated coordinate. T prime is equal A times T. And A now will be the transformation matrix to go from this coordinate system to that coordinate system. The normal in the transformed coordinate is n prime, is the rotation matrix times the vector n. Now we further substitute the definition of t, and t is sigma times n. In the next step, we use the second equation here and solve for n. So if we solve for n, we get A inverse times n prime, or A transpose times n prime. And finally, we can introduce this relationship into that equation, and one obtains that the transformed traction is A times sigma times A transpose T times n prime. That's coming from there. If we simply identify or make the equality between this expression and that expression, you will identify that sigma prime is nothing else than A times sigma times A transpose. So here you basically have the expression for the stress expressed in an arbitrary coordinate system where A is a transformation matrix to change between the two coordinate systems. So if you know sigma, if you change the coordinate system, you're able to describe the magnitude of sigma prime's component. So the rotation matrices are orthogonal. The determinant is 1, so you can do this kind of relationship here. The norms of sigma are independent on the coordinate. So for example, the magnitude of the traction or the principal stresses will not be depending on the coordinate system. So with this formula, one can express the stress tensor for any orientation. So let's keep rotating coordinates. So we take a stress tensor, which is here dense. It has the 4 components. But we will be looking for a basis for which the shear stresses will vanish. So it means for a given orientation, there exists a sigma prime for which sigma xy will be equal to 0. So, for example, if we rotate the coordinate system by a certain angle, we can end up in a configuration in which Tx is a line with the x prime axis and Ty is aligned with the y prime axis. So in that case, if we project Tx in the x prime y prime coordinate, we obtain only one component on the x prime direction. That will be sigma xx prime. And if we project Ty in the x prime y prime coordinate, there is no component along x prime, and everything is projected onto y prime, and we call it sigma yy prime. So we found here a basis for which there is no shear stress. We collect the two attractions together, and we can build the tensor into this specific coordinate system that vanishes shear stresses. So we will play with stress rotation in this lecture, but also in your exercise. So one thing you will have to do is I will give you a stress state here and the formula for the transformation of the stress with this transformation matrix here. And I will ask you to express the transform stress tensor, knowing the components here and the value of this. Then to express the normal stress, component 1, 1, and the shear stress, the component 1, 2. And then to simplify the expression using the double angle formula. So I ask you to use these relationships to derive the expression of sigma and tau, the shear stress and the normal stress. And for the lecture, I anyway give you the answer, so you only have to do the algebra steps, but the answer should look like this. The normal stress will be expressed as sigma 1 plus sigma 2 divided by 2 plus sigma 1 minus sigma 2 divided by 2 times cosine 2 theta. And the shear stress will simply be sigma 1 minus sigma 2 divided by 2 times sinus 2 theta. So we manage to express the rotated, the component of the rotated stress or the transform stress for any orientation. And the question is, great, we've done this job now, but what's the point of doing this? So the point of doing this is that now, by using this expression, we will simply substitute sigma 1 plus sigma 2 divided by 2 by sigma n, such that sigma is equal to sigma n plus sigma d divided by 2 times cosinus 2 theta. And we introduce sigma d, the differential stress, sigma 1 minus sigma 2. Then the shear stress is simply expressed as sigma d divided by 2 times sinus 2 theta. And what you can identify at this point is that these are the parametric equation for a circle. So with this, we can have a representation of 2D and 3D stress states in a two-dimensional space, in the space of normal stress and shear stress. So these are the two axes of interest. and you will do a practical exercise using the notebook. So you have here the normal stress. It's a function of the cosine of an angle, and the shear stress is function of the sinus of the angle, and the radius of the circle will be this value that multiplies the trigonometric function in each line. So let's have a look at how this looks like. So you have the normal stress axis. You see that the normal stress is negative, so the stress is negative under compression here. And you have the shear stress on that axis. And of course, this is the parametric equation of a circle, so a stress state will be represented by the blue circle here. The center is defined by sigma m, so that's the shift of the locus of the center of the circle is the value of sigma m. And then we have a radius to define the circle, and the radius is what multiplies the trigonometric function, so it's sigma d divided by 2. Then remember that sigma m and sigma d are defined in terms of sigma 1 and sigma 2. So here we have, for example, sigma 1 on that side of the circle. This is for an angle of 0. So we are in the base in which the shear stress will vanish. If sigma is equal to 0, you will obtain this formula. You will have sigma is equal to sigma m plus sigma d divided by 2, because cosine 2 times 0 is 1. Now, if we go for the angle of theta equals 90, the cosine will flip sine, and you will obtain that sigma is sigma m minus sigma d divided by 2. That corresponds to the second principal stress. Then we have the stress state here along the line with the two principal stresses of our object here. The center again is the mean of these two values. So if you take that one plus that one divided by 2, you obtain the center position. And if you make the difference between these two values, sigma 1 minus sigma 2, you obtain the diameter of the circle. So that's all our object. That is the differential stress. Now, talking about an angle, for an arbitrary angle, the angle is 2 theta. You can be anywhere along the circle here. So for a variation of theta between 0 and 90 degrees, since we have a factor 2, it varies between 0 and 180 degrees. So that defines all the possible stress states. So here, if we have a reference stress, which was a diagonal matrix, any rotation of the stress will produce stress states that include now shear stresses. So we have an arbitrary stress state, we'll have all the components. So what's also interesting with laboratory experiments is that the rocks, they can be deformed at a different magnitude of normal stress, and typically, and this leads to different types of failure patterns. But this anyway leads to failure. So if the normal stress is increasing, then we obtain this relationship of Byerlee, which I presented before. So you have all these points predicting one failure point. We can do a regression and we get the value of the shear stress versus the normal stress. It's a linear relation, so that's good. And it is mostly rock independent. There are granites, marbles, and so on. Different types of rocks, they go along the same line. So the criteria for yielding, the red line now, is formulated as a linear fit, and a linear fit has an intercept, C, the cohesion, or tau 0, and it has a slope that multiplies the x value, which is the negative normal stress here. So we will have tangent phi will be the slope of this line. For an intact rock, the cohesion is 50 megapascal. For a broken rock which has lost cohesion, then it goes close to 0. And the friction angle is about 30 to 35 degrees. This relation, it can be used together with the Mohr circle. Using both the Mohr circle and Byerlee's law, one can predict whether a rock is stable or unstable. It means, is it undergoing faulting, or is it simply elastic or viscoelastic without frictional plasticity? So that's an example here of a diagram that shows normal stress versus shear stress, and you see different types of circles. So you have one circle here, and you see that this circle is away from the yielding line. So this one is stable, and you see a second circle, and this circle is touching the yielding line. So for this stress state, one activates frictional plasticity. So this is a very useful relation. So you get to study whether a rock will be stable or not, and what you will have to do in your example in the notebook, you will actually have to determine whether you're in a stable condition or not in a stable condition. So that's what you will have to do in the exercise, and I will introduce the exercise during the session. So as a conclusion for the first part of this lecture on frictional plasticity, what I want you to remember is that the stress states, they're represented by a tensor, but they can be represented in a 2D space, shear stress versus normal stress. So that applies to 2D stress states, but also to 3D stress states. That's called the Mohr diagram. It has a diameter, which is the differential stress, and the location of the center corresponds to the magnitude of the mean stress. It's the negative pressure. What's also important to remember is that the shear stress upon which the rock fades can be measured in the lab. It depends on the mean stress. So that's the prediction of Byerlee's law. You get tau is equal to tau 0, or C, minus sigma m, the mean stress, times tangent phi, which is the friction angle. This angle varies between 30 and 35 degrees. And for intact rocks, tau 0, or cohesion, is about 50 megapascal. That's a very important law because it can be used to predict whether frictional plasticity occurs within a rock mass. And that's, of course, when you combine it together with a Mohr diagram. Thanks for your attention.